because it was a but we had F2. Why don't we do A through F2 on B? Yeah.
If we could reconvene, please. I believe we were in the middle of a conversation and a question.
Derek was.
I think Derek was commenting, but I'm trying to recall the question.
Well, I'm trying to recall as well, but let me see if I can generally say what I was. In general, we were talking about how it is important to understand, as Rob has pointed out, that you may be below standard, but if you are still in that same general area the next year, you're still making about a year's worth of growth. The challenge I was going to share regarding Mr. Walker's comments was this does not necessarily, these values do not necessarily assure that the students are making a year's worth of growth. And in fact, even in the positive movement, again, this is relative growth, the typical, the word that keeps getting used, typical movement. You could be slightly above typical movement, get a bunch of extra bonus points, but still not be making a full year's worth of growth because it wasn't typical of that group to do that. So, and I just would urge, you know, you really need to ask and try to understand, what do those numbers mean? What does 0 to 41 mean, 42 to 46 mean? I've been told it's not a percentile ranking. Okay, fine, then what is it? It certainly has no relationship whatsoever to proficiency. And so you could be continuing, because it was typical of your group, to not make a year's worth of growth, but get a lot of points for it. Or at the higher end, you could be making more than a year's worth of growth, but because you were being compared to others, it may be typical that that group made even more than that, and you actually get dinged for that. So it's a very relative thing compared to how your peer group has historically done. I know it's not a current measure of growth. It is as has been said, is a baseline that has been set, but it is a baseline that has been set based on an SGP measure, a student growth percentile, which is a comparison of how peers in your group have performed.
So if we take option D and take those exact comments and look at data around that, I'd be really interested as one board member to understand that in its entirety. What Derek just said, I want to understand that its entirety with Damien's input and some others. I want to understand the system if it indeed works that way.
So I believe, so I want to make sure.
We have that caption, I'm sure.
Right. And I think Deb should probably speak to that. I know the panel received what we call observed growth and how we arrived at the calculations. And perhaps that's something that you are wanting us to work, actually explain now.
Yeah, that'd be fine. Yeah, we could hear it right now, but that would be one, without getting too deep in the weeds today, I'd like to hear it.
Because we can actually send that to you as well, so.
Yeah, members did receive a 9-page explanation of all of the various components that were set within option D. Within option D, you'll note that we have a few things that were actually established. The first one is the point values itself. There are details for this page how they arrived at the point values. It'll then undergo an exercise in which they assign points, -2 to 2, ranking each of these outcomes. They took each of those small group work and created a values table without points, which established what is a better outcome, what do they value more in these outcomes. That work then translated into points, how we actually arrive at these different point values. Next component we took a look at is establishing these prior year statuses and establishing cut scores for the prior year statuses as well as current year statuses when taking a look at a full categorical model. There were two iterations of this information that was created. First iteration actually just divided each of the did not pass, pass, and pass plus into equal bands, just dividing the point values in those bands equally to derive the subcategories that we wanted to look at. That information, through analysis, did not prove to work very well in that we, in fact, only managed to add one additional category when we added five categories to our subbands. What we mean by that is looking at the distributions of this information, over 90%, 95% of all the students fell within four categories of pass one, pass two. Did not pass three, pass one, pass two, and pass plus one. So through work with Damien, we developed a secondary process for establishing these cut scores. We knew this would be an iterative process. We have to take a look at the cut scores and then we establish them. In addition, we found that there was very little movement in those first iteration of cut scores as well, primarily because we didn't break up the pass band itself into enough categories. We also found that the original recommendation had 3 bands in the pass plus category. We found that there just was not enough information and the points on the scale really would withstand or substantiate having 3 bands in that pass plus. So we dropped one of those bands and made it 2 bands in the top category. We also added a 3rd band within the pass status. Again, because this is where most of the students are, and to be able to get to more movement and show more students actually moving across those subcategories, we changed that to 3 bands. And then finally left 3 bands at the did not pass level. In order to get a better distribution, we actually dove in and took a look at student distributions for the past, I want to say 4 years. We'll go with 4 years for right now. So we dove into the past 4 years worth of data to determine distributions and to try to divide these bands equally using those distributions of students. So we established cut scores, which went into these categories, again based on those distributions, and then dove into some analysis of distributions moving across categories, and what we found, we did successfully break out those categories such that we had much more equal distribution across all of the 8 categories that were established rather than just 4 categories centered in the middle of our scale score group. So we did find success in that. Additionally, we found that 60% of students were then, again on the categorical improvement side, transitioning across category statuses, which was a far improvement from version 1. However, that still did leave 40% of students remaining within the band, and this is where their static came from. Basically meaning that they started at a certain status and remained at that status the next year. So within those bands, we couldn't see definitively what direction they were moving in. We did also establish that 20 points scale score was the minimum that we could achieve or minimum we could use on any of these bands. Therefore, we cannot subdivide specifically our past categories any farther. We really couldn't substantiate having any additional bands added to these subcategories. So I did want to note that, and that 8 was the maximum number of bands we could really get out of our scale at this point. So we jump into observed growth targets next. Again, these are our target ranges that were established. Observed growth target ranges and movement classifications were based on the examination of categorical status improvement model. And the observed pattern of incremental mean growth across category statuses. The observed growth target range are a key component for establishing points with the values table. The target ranges create a threshold for which points are to be assigned. In review of the student distribution for the categorical status improvement, it is found that between 85 and 90% of the students, all students, fell within 3 outcomes. Static, again, meaning that the students did not transition a subcategory from the prior year to the current year. Improved one category, meaning that possibly they started at a pass 1 and progressed In transitioning to the observed growth, the actual outcome of category movement was incorporated into this values table with the analysis of the observed growth component. The mean observed growth for each movement classification was analyzed to establish these target ranges. So what that means is, we took a look at all of the students that actually had this movement and established what was the mean growth that they saw. Took a look at all the students that were static and what was the mean growth within that category as well. And took a look at all the students that had negative growth or actually moved back one category. And took a look at what was their observed growth component and mean observed growth as well to help establish these targets. We went through 2 iterations under option D. 2 strategies were used to set these targets. Target range, first one is the target range is consistent with each proficiency category. So did not pass range was the same, pass range was the same, pass plus range was the same. This is what we call option DA, which we transitioned away from. We'll go with a different one. But under this option, we kept each of those ranges the same, and then we valued the points, or varied the points, based on where the student started in their prior year category status. Second option, the target range are specific to each status category, and point values are more constant within those did not pass, pass, and pass plus categories. For this option, the target ranges were established based on the median growth observed in each proficiency category for students not changing status. So in other words, if we go back to our categorical model, which I think the board had an opportunity to look at previously as well, if you consider the diagonal across that categorical status model, it's always highlighted blue. These are the students that start to pass one in the prior year and pass one again this year. We call those static or no movement on that categorical improvement model. Take a look at all those students. And basically, when you get this report, you'll notice on page 6, so we were able to see incremental increases across each of these subcategories. So for example, we looked at the 2013 mean growth for all students that, again, 40%. For all students that did not transition a category between 2012 and 2013. The lowest category, their mean growth was 28 for in 2013. In 2012, it was 27.5. When we moved up the next category to did not pass 2, the mean growth in 2013 was 35, and in 2012 it was 37. So again, we started seeing this observed pattern in which there actually is incremental changes in growth. What this is telling us is that students at the did not pass, lowest level of did not pass, did not need to experience as much growth to move up to the next category. Their needs were much lower. Does that make sense? Okay.
I will definitely, in fact, we can get them run this off for you, Leanne. Do you have it?
Additional copies.
Oh, you do have it. We did Okay. pass it out to you.
It's in the folder. It's in the packet. It's in the folder. Or it's in the binder. I have it.
Great. Wasn't sure it was included. So since they have it, do you have it?
No,
I think you ran it.
I think it was
It was
delivered.
Yeah,
In,
in your folder that you got. In what was given to you electronically.
oh,
We gave it to you ahead of time.
It was in,
And so since we do have it with us, I think, yeah, there you got it.
Page
There it
7.
is. If you would look, I think it will make more sense now if you just quickly go back through. Start on page 5. Start on page 5. Those charts will look very familiar to you. Oh, it's not the same page 5.
mine's on page 6.
Okay, yeah, find the page that has your actual diagonal charts. And so why don't you start from there?
It was in the.
It's in the
It's
big
in your
packet.
binder that was given to you.
It's after the presentation. If you,
Sorry, I didn't realize that you actually had a copy, so that's good. Because I was going to run them off for you.
flip behind that line, that. There you go. You're almost there.
And
Go to
in
page
this,
6.
in this paper, we talk about the observed growth target ranges and the score that's derived and how we actually arrived at the target range. So on your diagonal charts, why don't you just start right there, Deb, and just reiterate what you just talked about, because I think it'll be more clear.
Sure, flip back even one page before that, you'll notice that there's a small chart titled Student Distribution Across Status Categories. It's a very small chart, and it simply states prior year status and percent students in band. It just reflects the first iteration of the test scores, and you can see the clustering between the pass plus one and did not pass three, that it really consumed most of the students in the state. In other words, when we were trying to apply additional bands across our statuses, this iteration of class scores really were not successful to show that. So we jump into the next set of graphs entitled Student Distribution Across Status Categories with Revised Cut Scores. And again, the totals across the bottom, you can see a more even distribution across all 8 of these categories, subcategories that were defined. The blue diagonal is gray on my page, so hopefully you got a color copy of it. The blue diagonal across each of these, again, shows those students that were not actually transitioning a category between years. So their prior year status is the same as their current year status. If you do the quick math on this, you'll find that those students are approximately 40% of all of the students. So 60% of the students either fall above or below that diagonal and show movement across from year to year. So again, 60% of the kids, we can see the movement. 40%, they're still within that band, and under this categorical model, can't really tell if they're on a trajectory to move up, on a trajectory to move down, or where they really are within those bands.
And it was the goal of the committee that we show growth for all students.
So I have a question.
Capture that.
So if you have a school where the overwhelming majority of the students at this particular school are gonna be pass plus students, they're not gonna get a lot of growth points. Is that what's leading to the reduction in the A schools, so to speak?
I think we've accommodated for that on our chart.
Yeah.
The pass plus 2 band, you'll notice that those points have been adjusted so that they're not receiving 0 or 50 points if they're showing a slight decline at the very upper level.
To your point, yeah, I'll let Michelle go ahead and address that more fully.
I didn't know if Tony was maybe asking about the gray chart, so I think looking at the chart with the gray
He was.
diagonal, we weren't able to use the categorical model because of that reason, because 40% of students weren't showing any growth whatsoever, even though they might have been growing within their band. So a student who was at, let's say, Pass Plus 1 the previous year and stayed in Pass Plus 1, but actually moved up within Pass Plus 1, with this model, we had no way of measuring that, which is why we didn't stay on this one.
So with this option, that's not an issue?
Which is why we moved to the observed growth.
So when we run the numbers or compare them to real data we have, do we still expect there to be a reduction in A schools with the application of this?
Yeah, I'll have to defer to Debbie, because I didn't look at that far.
Yes, the distribution we were looking at does run in the DF2 option that we looked at, and we do see that reduction in the A schools. I think Dr. Derek Briggs actually has do an exercise during the accountability panel where we went through a distribution exercise and expectations in each of these categories, and did recommend that at some point that does become an exercise of expected distributions of grades. What is the expected outcome?
That was very poorly received in my district when AYP came in, where we had schools that everyone knew they were A schools, but they couldn't get an A for one reason or another, they were being capped by AYP. So I would hope we would make an adjustment here where that doesn't happen again as a result of this new model, where we have schools that we know are A schools, all of a sudden are gonna show up as B schools.
Yeah, there's no cap kind of process like you just described, Tony.
But there's a reduction.
Well, you can't compare the two models side by side because they're not calculated in the same manner. The new model is going to calculate individual student growth. And so in looking at the information, this is the calculation that would result, and this is the spread that would result. Yes, go ahead, Sarah.
I think
Sorry.
just following up on Mr. Walker's point, and I get that they are charted differently, they are calculated differently. But if I am, again, looking at simplicity, if I am looking to share this message with my schools and my fellow teachers and parents, how do I explain the difference between the prior calculations and the new calculations? If my school is no longer an A, based on the changes we're making today, how do I put that in simplistic terminology to explain, when they're doing the exact same thing, what we're looking at differently that changes that categorization?
Well, there are several things that we'll have to be explaining. Number one, we've gone from a 4-point system to a 100-point system. And in the current system, when you get a penalty, and if you didn't meet the participation piece and you didn't meet, and you also had a penalty, you went down 2 letter grades right away. So we're going from a 4-point scale of penalty and bonus to a 100-point scale based on individual student growth. So every student counts. Every student counts. So every student will be earning points for the school according to how they grow and according to how they perform. So both metrics separately. In the current model, that doesn't happen. So that's why it's, when you switch to a new model, even when we went from the model previous to the one we're doing now, there's going to be some type of communication shift in which we need to do that. So communication is extremely important when we switch to the new model, because we have to be sure people understand what it is that the test scores are going to reflect on student performance and student growth. But you're right, we have to communicate, we have to talk about what it is. It's not necessarily, it's a different way of looking at the growth. And when it's static, once we have the baseline, then in addition to that, you always know how it is that students are growing, because it's going to be individualized.
But now we've talked about taking away the penalty point this year, but that still doesn't explain a drop in the letter grade.
What do you mean by taking away the penalty point this year?
No, just, you mentioned in the new process that the penalty point is removed. I'm just trying to play devil's advocate.
Oh, yeah, there's no
for how we're
penalty.
looking
Yeah,
at
yeah, oh, yeah,
We're taking away a
communication.
penalty point, if anything, that further complicates why an A would drop and no longer be an A.
Yeah, I think we have
Sarah?
several people who want to respond to that. So
Yeah.
Carrie, why you be first, and then Keith, and then Steve.
One of the panel members, as we talked about this at the last meeting, said, and it was an interesting observation, was if we expect the same results, then we would keep the same system. And so that's something to keep in mind. We're gonna have different results, and there will be people who move up and people who move down. And so that, people need to be prepared for some of that. The other thing, even looking ahead to a new assessment that we've already talked about is gonna be more rigorous. And although it's not calculated in this in terms of that, and our standards are more rigorous, that there will be people who adjust down, and my school may be one of them. So it's something we've got to communicate.
And I'm okay with that. I want that message to be clear,
Yeah.
that I want everyone in this room and everyone in our communities to be able to explain exactly why.
Right.
it
No, and I
happened.
agree. I think we all have to be able to explain it,
Right.
and it's not simple.
And I'm not
But
sure we're there.
no, but I just thought it was an interesting comment. If we want the same results, then we should stay with the same model we currently have.
Keith, and then Steve Baker.
I think on some of that, Sarah, you have to look at, for the higher performing schools, that because we've always just been measuring performance consistently across, and for a school with about 90% pass rate, if they are a school that is K-5, and then you're looking at their middle school grades later and saying, why is it that the elementary is always at an A, but the middle school is at a B? If you go back now and you're looking at the growth, you may start to see that, yes, based on performance, you've got 90% of your students passing the test, but over time in the building, they're slipping just a little bit, but not enough for that calculation based solely on performance to change until they get into a new configuration of a school. This, because then it rolls in that performance side, says if your students aren't staying where, if they're not keeping up, if they're not showing a year's worth of growth, if too many of them are sliding backwards, then that needs to be adjusted in the work of the school. And I think that's where that spotlight will be. Conversely, I think perhaps you could see a school with an 89% pass rate that is really pushing their students in growth, that it's possible for them to bump into that A category. So if you're looking strictly on the number of students who passed the bar line, that's going to give you one look at the school. But when you look at the growth, that's going to give you another indicator. And that's where I think that shift is going to occur.
And Debbie, you correct me if I'm like totally in left field, but when you're looking at the top of page 18 and you're looking at the number of A's, currently that's not really saying that you have A schools that are going to be B's or B. What it's saying is, in the new model, here's the distribution. Based on here's the distribution of the grades on the new model. Here was the distribution of the grades under the old model. So it's not necessarily a school-by-school comparison, so to speak. And so that's really what that's indicating. I think Steve Baker was next, and then we'll take Jessica.
Really very good questions, and to the state board, welcome to our A to F panel meeting.
Right.
This is what happens, because there are several people coming from different backgrounds, and we do spend a lot of time sometimes on one point, and we may say that's not relevant, but it really is. And so 13 meetings, but you understand why they were 6, 7, 8 hours long, and you think, well, you guys didn't get far, and you're not saying that. But there's just a lot of detail to talk about. And you bring up a very good point, Mr. Walker, because I brought up the same thing. If we're an A school under this model, then we should be an A school under any fair model. Then, of course, you have to define what fair is. So that is my concern, and then that's when my colleagues stressed about, well, we'll be measuring growth for all students, you know, especially at the high school level, which we're not doing now, and that will change some things. But I am concerned about that, because now going to Sarah's point, okay, in my opinion, a majority of people only look at the grade and are not interested in explanation. I can explain all I want, but I'll be talking to very few people. They look at the grade and that's it. So I think what we also have to look at, when you talk about penalty points, I think what we're going to start explaining to them is they have the opportunity to receive fewer points. If 100 points is where the norm is, more is 125, less is 70. You just have the opportunity of gaining less points or more points instead of penalty. And I think what we also have to understand in our explanation is we're doing growth to peers now, and I understand enough, I think, to know that growth to peers versus growth to individual really changes the game so much that the comparisons are just so hard to do when we start breaking it down, in my opinion. And the last thing I want to address, because we've been talking about this, and they're just such valid points, is this. I was the #1 person as we started this meeting, some might call annoying and they would probably be accurate, that I kept saying, this must be simple, this must be simple, this must be transparent. If you look at the current high school model, which I was on the original panel with that, I believe along with Scott, we're the only two on that. The high school model is extremely simple right now. You know why? Because there's no growth. There's performance and there's improvement. Improvement is not growth, and that's easy to explain, and it's really easy to figure your grade. I can figure my grade before I get it from the DOE. Once you bring in growth, this is just my opinion, simplicity goes out the window. And the only way to change that is to make it not fair. If you pass enough students, you get a grade, and if you don't. and you can do improvement a little bit, but once you bring in growth, I have found in serving on this panel, that's where all of our, we're hardly discussing performance. It's we're not discussing improvement, which is our current high school model. We're going from a simple high school model to a very complex high school model that I have to go and explain to many, many principals across the state of Indiana, and it gets complicated. But here's what I want to say to that. I am willing to trade simplicity for fairness. And I believe the complexity we picked up has been a good thing because it has become more fair. It may be more difficult to understand. We may not be able to crunch all the numbers. But the fairness factor is the number one thing I'm concerned about more than simplicity. Maybe not everyone feels that way, but I am. Because at the end of the day, I would rather it be fair than instead that I can explain it to everyone. So please understand as we go down this growth road and continue to do so, it will be complicated, and we're not going to be able to have a nice, sleek presentation of here it is and everybody will understand it. I don't think that's possible, but I'm willing to trade that. So that's my comments on the growth part.
And just looking at page 5, where, when we were looking at these, all of these different pass zones have cut scores. So we've set almost like 8 different standard areas. We want kids to continually pass the zones, as well as show growth within the bands. So, I just want to make sure that, because it says up there, student distributions across status categories with revised cut scores. So that we've got those standard kinds of pieces in place, and we know we want to have those. Jessica.
And so, speaking to your point, Ms. O'Brien, is one of the things that concerns me, not just the amounts of schools that we're projecting with this new model would not be A's, but more alarming to me are the number of schools that are currently F's that are not F's in the system. Because quite honestly, I feel like it's calling a tiger by the same colored stripes is still a tiger. And if we're not acknowledging that our schools are failing, then we aren't going to put the appropriate things in place to help remedy the situation. So why I believe wholeheartedly in ensuring that we're looking at growth and we're making sure that we acknowledge it and we're rewarding growth, we still need to understand that there will be schools that fail, and those schools that fail need the support. And it alarms me greatly that the number is skewed here, because I think there will be a number of children in underperforming schools that we will say no longer are underperforming, but somehow now you're a D or you're a C. And that to me is very, very concerning.
I have a question.
Yes, Dean.
Thanks for your comment. I have a question on that. Could we start to address that phenomenon possibility by adjusting the percentage we put on growth and percentage we put on performance? And probably you've been through this many times, but for example, could we potentially place 75% on performance, 25% on growth? Would that statistically adjust for that? And maybe it's not a question for you, Jessica, maybe it's a question for experts or...
Debbie, go ahead. It's a conversation we've had.
That's what I figured.
Yes.
What page number is that?
It's the top of 18 in your PowerPoint.
We've got many iterations of option D, some adjusting those values, those point values, and providing different outcomes based on different point values that are assigned for each of those transitions. Under the observed growth summary information, if we look at the 2013 information, it's very interesting to look at performance-only information where the distributions actually start. So if we compare the 2013 overall performance only compared to the current growth model, specifically looking at the F category, you'll notice that currently, based on performance alone, there are 54 schools or 3.26% that would start off as an F.
Performance
based on
on.
performance alone. Under the current A through F model, that number ends up being 108. So again, the current measure of growth have lowered, basically done the number of schools that ended up in the F category when growth was actually applied to those schools.
Can you explain to them why it is as it is currently?
So this has to do with the penalties that are assessed. Again, we've done some information and some studies on swings in schools and the impact of these bonuses and penalties. Essentially, the bonuses tend to raise the school, obviously, but those schools are usually in the B and C category to start with, so they're typically raised up to the A or B category. The D and the C schools are generally then lower down and receive those penalties and end up into this F category. So in other words, when we've done a lot of review of correlation information, correlation of performance to growth, I think this is a concern or a limitation that we found within our current system as well, and that we do see significant schools receiving a grade that is lower than their performance along grade.
Let me explain where I'm coming from. I don't think we should rig the system based on what percentage of schools we want A's or what percentage we want F's. And with bonus points and disincentives, it seems like a game show at some point. But however, we need to have an accurate representation of this. And I get a little concerned with the complexity that it's so complex that we've lost sort of the basic purpose, which is to provide good information to students and parents and communities about how their schools are doing. And so all these charts are useful on how it will be applied potentially based on last year's scores. But at a policy level, I caution us on tinkering with the system based on what percentage we want to have F's or A's. And so what I'm looking for is the most accurate representation we should get. And I'm not sure the option D is there yet. And the panel has done fabulous work. But I'm still a little uncomfortable that there's still some things here that we're either missing or we need to tinker with the percentages in a way that presents an accurate representation of what the schools are actually doing.
So currently in what you have here, because the performance only is very important to look at. So based on performance only, we had 54 schools underneath this model
Right.
that would have received an F. When we bring in the individual growth component and give schools credit for actually having student growth within the bands, then we have 30 schools
Right.
that are with that. So it's you have to really look at that performance piece. But so we've got a 50-50 split right now, and that's what we've been working with. We did have a 60-40, 40% performance and 60% growth, and that gave us information that was skewed. So we did, as a panel, say that we preferred the 50-50 growth. So I hear you asking, though, that we might even look at other configurations of that to see how it comes out.
Yeah, that's what I'm recommending. I'd like to see more emphasis placed on performance, just a set of charts to look at that to address Jessica's comments. And again, I don't think we should skew the system with a magic number of what percentage of students should be A or F. But I would hope the discussion would be around what's a more accurate representation.
Here's my concern about Jessica's comment, is that you're trying to compare apple to oranges, communities to different communities, when you talk about performance and growth. When we're talking about growth, we're talking about what is the school, every school, whether they're an A school or they're an F school, what are they doing with their students? How good is that school? When you talk about just performance and you have students that come into you that are scoring at the 20th percentile to start with, and they get those kids to the 40th percentile, that's a heck of a group of teachers.
Absolutely.
Okay?
Absolutely.
That is huge amounts of growth. Did they still get an F as far as achievement? Yes, but are they doing their job? Absolutely. Is that a school where a student who is low performing is going to do well? Absolutely. Now, if I go to an A school and I look at performance and they have 90% achievement and they just stay at 90% achievement because of community dynamics or whatever it may be, because at home they have all kinds of books. Is that school doing a great job? I can't tell you that they are. What I can tell you is if we use growth along with achievement, we can say what those kids are doing, how teachers have affected those students in growth if they're compared to themselves. And my fear is that we go once again way over to the achievement, and then we're no longer looking at how that school does. It's not about how they achieve necessarily. It's how they achieve, but how does the school do to make those kids go towards achieving at the highest level that can be achieved? And my concern about going to 75% performance would be the fact that you are saying to all those schools that are doing amazing amounts of work, the one thing that our system did now is those bonus points awarded those schools that really had huge amounts of growth. That's about the only thing I liked about the model, to be quite honest. Growth does not award anybody. It says you're doing a good job. This student, you have worked with this student, and they're doing a good job. I fear that when we start taking away growth, and looking at these numbers, if we really want to hold schools, teachers, ourselves accountable, where they fall in there shouldn't matter to us. We should have the best model possible. And if it lowers the number of Fs we have or raises the number of As, that's great. But if we don't set up a model that includes growth to a great amount, I think we are severely hindering great teachers, great educators, superintendents, whatever it may be. And I just had to say that before we went on.
And I'd like to add that the panel really valued growth in our model. It had to be a substantial piece of what it is that we were charged to do. So we weren't willing as a panel to go any lower than 50-50. We just kind of set it that way. But in addition, I guess I would say that I'm going to go back to Carrie's comments. We're going to have more rigorous assessments. We're going to have several factors that will influence the spread, so to speak, of what it is that we're going to do and how things look. And we'll all have to know that we're working on individual student growth, and that's what it's about. And moving forward, here's what we want to see. The beauty of what we have here is that schools are going to be able to see two totally separate metrics: performance and achievement. And if a school has low achievement but high growth, they're headed in good directions, and they have to know that. In our current model, they don't know, but they have to know it, and they have to see it statistically, and they have to see what it looks like. And that's what I'm most excited about, because they're going to see their performance, you betcha, but they're also going to see what does that growth look like of your students within that model too, and what is it you need to do to always improve. We're under federal mandates. I just like to take us back to the federal mandates. We're under federal mandates to do these accountability systems, federal. And we have to put schools in improvement categories. So it is about improvement. And with the waiver, we were given the opportunity to add in those added measure of growth. And so that's what we're doing here. But it's about improvement, and we have to see both of those pieces separately in order to make that really be about improvement of schools. And someone had their hand up. Oh, Sheila. Sorry, Sheila.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, I think one of the inherent values of placing emphasis on growth is that you are looking very clearly at a snapshot of the work done within that school year. And that's something that this panel really valued in terms of what the system would tell us. Because if we're talking about assigning a letter grade for a specific school year, then we don't want that letter grade, in what Robert was alluding to, we don't want that letter grade to be a continual reflection of where students came in when they first started their school education or when they first started at your school.
We want that letter grade to be a reflection of the work that happened within those 180 days that the staff and the teachers did, and how did that look. And so I think that that's where the growth comes in. And I think I understand Jessica's sentiment around the number of Fs, but I really appreciate that we're not going to just say like, well, we need 15% of schools to be an F, because I think with this system, what we're actually really doing is taking the tiger, if you will, and redefining how we name that. And we are going to really be able to get a much clearer picture, whether it's this system or some other system. I'm not convinced this is the best one, but I think the ideas behind it and the growth within it gives us a very clear picture, whether it's people at the DOE, people at the state board, gives a very clear picture of what are schools doing within that year and what further supports do they need, and just redefining how that looks is going to be what's going to change the game in schools that aren't doing that.
And I would say that no matter what, the federal government requires us to assist schools in a bottom certain percentage of schools, no matter what their grade is. So we have obligations at the state level to be sure that we're putting in support systems for schools, regardless of the grade, because the federal government requires percentage pieces that we have supports put in place, rigorous supports.
I might be taking us too far into the weeds here, but I'll put it there anyway.
Oh, we've been in the weeds.
Right?
A lot.
So Lauren Moore waiting for us out here.
Right, exactly. Just to give us some better perspective on the actual application of the proposed sample here of option D, we have a number of schools that at this point, as a board, we have intervened in because of habitual patterns needing assistance. And we've gotten to know those schools on an intimate basis, much more so than most of the schools across the state. I'm curious to see if we apply option D's format to those schools, are they all still in that bottom F category, or do any of them get lifted out of it? Knowing what we know about their day-to-day operations and the intense need for support at that level. Have we run any of those numbers to know how they apply in option D?
We've definitely run all of the data for all of the schools. I don't believe I've done any analysis of that list of schools, but we can certainly do that cross-analysis of the list of schools. And we just want to provide that list and focus on the schools. To see
I think it would be a
what
good perspective for us.
Troy?
Was there any consideration looking at school size as we look at this growth model, as we have the atypical schools that we have difficulty fitting into an A to F model? Is there going to be an N factor, a small number that is still in place, or is it going to be just totally based individually?
So Debbie, I think looking at this might be the best place. So you have in your packet this sample where we've broken out performance, growth, multiple measures, and the overall. And what you'll see with the overall model, because what I think you're asking is, are we going to have a configuration issue? And the model is created to not have configuration issue except for K2.
Right.
All right, because we don't have any assessment data on those students at a state level. So why don't you kind of walk through that and what that might look like? Because there's a calculation really that takes care of that.
So within the resolution that I believe everybody received concerning the framework, you'll see the lovely equation that gets to the grade for each school. We were able to accommodate for all the various scenarios of school configurations by using enrollment within each of the grade spans to offset or accommodate for all of the grade configurations. So keep in mind as we transition or move forward, we will likely be having assessments in grades 3 through 10 finally, we get into the multiple measures of the graduation rate. We'll discuss return on investment in a second, and college and career ready achievement. Under each of these, again, we do have the enrollment counts and enrollment ratios. When we take a look at that formula, you can see how all of those components go together to create a single formula for all the schools. There's some additional considerations into the formula to account for missing data. How do we accommodate if there's any missing components to ensure that we have a fair calculation for that?
And does this help as well to look at this visual? The calculation's not on there, but you can see that where everything is, everything's considered, and it's actually divided by the sum of the components that you actually have. So we don't have to deal with
So we won't have a
configurations
small-
anymore.
We won't have a small subgroup that they
No.
can't get data on anymore, which will eliminate a lot of the
Yes.
confusion.
So Troy, to your point, I think they'll still have to keep a minimum count of students and populations to ensure statistical viability. So it's accuracy. But it does change a little bit in that we're not looking at grades 3 through 8 and 10, we're looking at 3 through 10, which means more schools can then achieve that total student count since we're putting that together. Currently, under graduation as well as college career readiness, the end size is 10. I don't think we recommend any changes on that either.
Does it affect the larger schools and the corporations that are larger? Was that considered in this?
What do you mean?
Like, we had the small ones that had, but there's also large ones that have a whole bunch of schools that feed in. Will that, because their ratios will be very large, would that be, when you're looking at statistics, the more numbers you have, the more range that you have? And is that considered fair to them?
I think at the end of this recommendation is reflective of the actual enrollment into those grade spans, so that it does reflect those changes in population in the different grade spans. So if for some reason there's more students in the lower end, you can see that reflected in the campus.
Dan?
I'd like to lift us out of the weeds for a moment. It's the deja vu all over again, but the years ago when we moved to this, and pick up a little bit, Jessica, and your comment, and I think Sheila, I appreciate growth because you can have heroic, it takes us back really to our strategic plan where every child will learn in Indiana, will develop. That's why it's so central to what our board's doing. We need to lead towards a vision and a strong strategy to get there. So it was about every child learns, and we understand who is and who isn't going to be able to participate in our society fully. So what I don't want to, and then we also talk about developing great educators and having the community involved. If we get a system, and we won't, but we take this D and we modify, look at one thing at the end of the day we have to know. It also rates our task force on turnaround. And Sarah, you broach it. A few things are coming together here. When I think about our strategic planning committee, I'm thinking about maybe a home for this project. You cannot give a school a grade that deceives the children, their parents, and the public. And that's not renaming or saying we have to have 15% Fs. But a lot of our board members spend a lot of time in chronically failing schools, and essentially, folks, the children in those schools, in those communities, have a very dismal future if that does not get turned around. And alarms need to go off. According to our strategic plan, we aren't going to allow certain schools, well, that's going to be as good as they're going to get. And it doesn't allow us to leave the human capacity as is. And it doesn't allow us to have the community sit on the sideline and say, well, it's not my kids. So if we have a system that rewards growth a lot because we want to encourage teachers and students and educators to be there and grow folks, everybody's for that. How do we make sure we're not deceiving folks from all hands on deck? Community, educators, all hands on deck. So we cannot obscure and leave folks most disadvantaged, vulnerable in communities that have been isolated. If this system leads to that, it's not acceptable. So a grade should not obscure a crisis. And so, you know, I remember back when deja vu all over, one of the things we talked about originally implemented through F, you need a score, an A through F, but is there another part of the report card that comes out and gets prominence? I don't know if we want to go to that. We wanted to keep it simple and have a grade so everybody understood it, but you could get a passing grade that say, look at, good job improving, but folks, at the rate you're going, your children will not have a good chance of participating in our culture, society, economy, or whatever. They're basically on a trajectory to not being able to participate, and that's morally, ethically, professionally unacceptable. So it might fit this whole deal in the structure of strategic planning, because our strategic plan goal 1 was every child, no matter where they will be educated to proficiency. And so I have a little concern here as we move forward in this and refine it, that we don't lose track of an obligation we have as leaders to not leave some folks behind and tell them your grade's not all that bad. We should probably tell them your grade's not all that bad, but at the rate you're going, you have a lot of children that'll have a very difficult time in the world. Very difficult.
Steve Baker?
Two things, one addressing that, and then one I want to just kind of shift gears a little bit if we can. I think that's a concern of any model you have, and I agree with you. You don't want to deceive the public. You don't want to reward schools who aren't getting the job done, and you don't want to punish schools who are getting the job done. And that goes back to the definition of fairness. And that's where, again, where unfortunately the complexity sometimes is necessary, because I think if you keep it too simple, you run the risk of not being accurate. And so that's the part we're going to have to work on, if option D or whatever. But I agree wholeheartedly, that's where the fairness and accuracy has to come into play. So I think that has to continue to be on the table as we look at any model, anytime we evaluate schools or children. Just like a child who receives a grade, is that indicative of that child, or is that some, biased opinion versus objectivity? We always want that in our models. I want to throw this out, and I can only speak for myself. I will not speak for anyone else. But I had the opportunity to present, as we were going through this discussion for, I think, now a year and a half, I had the opportunity to travel all over the state, literally, and talk to principals. So I just want you to know that basically what I did was I took what Debbie just had up there. It looked a little different than this. And on the other side was what we were talking about at the time, categorical, which I'm still convinced is what option D looks like, enough that I think there's enough consistency and value there. And that was the worksheet that I handed out. And I just want you to know, as soon as I said elementary, middle school principals, peer-to-peer comparisons are out, and Johnny to Johnny from 4th to 5th grade is in, I'm telling you, the sigh of relief was unbelievable. That's what they're wanting to hear. I did this in about a 45-minute presentation. We've been spending hours and hours and hours and hours. So again, I want to go back to, people don't have to know every detail. If I say we're going to focus on individual growth versus peer-to-peer, for the most part, people understand that, and that's enough for them to go get their job done. Now, it may not be enough in all circumstances, but that's the one thing they're wanting to hear, is that growth part. The other part they liked was on this, how it simplified the explanation. So those of us that don't always have to get down into weeds, but just want to take a snapshot, this was very good as well. So I just want you to know, and Scott presented on this as well to some people, he can certainly speak and give his own opinion. This was received well by the field, and especially when I said the panel values growth. I literally, for one of the few times in my life, I got applauded. That doesn't happen very often. Because they were so happy that those teachers have worked so hard that they will be valued for moving a student even though they're not there yet. And again, at the high school model, there is none of that right now. You either pass or you don't, and there's an improvement. There's no growth. So I'm just letting you know, in the 45-minute snapshot I was able to deliver, it was received well by those in the field, and they believe, and again, they don't know all the D and D1, DF2 options, so they can't make that judgment. But from what they are seeing, if I'm portraying it accurately, they are supporting, or they are liking what they're seeing in general terms. So I just wanted to give you that information based upon many, I would say 15 to 20 presentations to hundreds of principals, and I hope to do it again in November with the help of Debbie Daly at the Principals Conference, where we'll do it to hundreds of principals all at one time and get that information in their hands.
David?
Thanks for your comments. I want to go back to what Dan had to say. And in leadership, what we're trying to do through this system, I believe, is defining reality. What is reality? And we don't want to send a misperception to the community and others. And so I'm looking at this option D, and there's a lot of great people here, a lot of great resources who are working in school for many, many years. And my question goes back to a comment I made about 10 minutes ago about whether the system is actually going to define reality in an accurate kind of way. And people on the panel, you must have looked at option D and sort of thought about your own school or schools and said, will this model, when implemented, will it provide an accurate representation? I'm going to leave fair out for a second. Just an accurate representation of this particular school. And I would like to get several panel members to say, yes, the recommended option D will give 100% accurate representation, or maybe it's a 20%. What's your perceptions? Yes.
I think that's a very easy answer. We don't know. I mean, we just don't know. We've heard repeatedly you cannot compare both models. And so to Mrs. O'Brien's question, how will those takeover schools fare? We don't know. We have a more rigorous standards and a more rigorous assessment. And so to give those folks false hope that they might do better under this, we just don't know. I think it's important to notice that, at least for the board to consider, as those requests for proposals for assessment are going out, to consider what you've talked about today. Are there item analysis that you can build into assessments that help you demonstrate growth, the type of growth that you want? That these things should work in concert, not that we come up with a grading plan and then come up with an assessment plan. If we really want to show growth, let's put that in the proposal to show that growth in the assessment. And the last thing, and I think this is something to keep in mind, remember that next year will be a new assessment on new, more rigorous standards with a new grading scale. And so people that don't do well on those two things, there will be plenty of places to blame. All right? They'll blame the grading scale for being wrong, or they'll blame the new standards, or they'll blame both, but there will be plenty of places to blame when things don't go according to plan. So I think it's important to note that it won't just be the grading scale. There'll be a number of issues next spring when those things roll out. But to answer your question quite truthfully, we don't know, and if anyone says that we do know, that's not true.
So does everyone else agree?
Yeah.
Show of hands, we don't know?
Yeah,
Okay.
we have to implement it.
I can add to that. One of the pieces of evidence to that I encourage you to look at in several of the reports that Damien and Betabent are provided, including the one that we all have in our packets on page 5, there's this chart that looks at, it takes the proposed model.
Damien's?
Yes.
That's Debbie's. That's Debbie's.
Oh,
That's
I'm sorry,
Debbie's.
Debbie's, but it was pulled from your work with Damien, right?
Yeah, I think that's Debbie's.
And these looked at where students were falling on these categorical improvement charts, which is different than the chart that we're using for Model D. But what's interesting about this, as you look across the chart, the most common outcome for each grouping of students, looking at their previous level, so looking at Pass Plus 2, the most common outcome is, in the next year, is where they started. So you look, if you look across Pass Plus 2, the highest number that you see is still in Pass Plus 2. You can go down to Pass 3, and the highest number, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the ELA chart. The highest number in Pass 3 is still Pass 3. There's one exception to the chart in both math and English, and that is looking at the highest level of did not pass, so right below the bar. The highest number in both math and English is at pass 1, meaning that there were more students for that one category who went from did not pass 3 to pass 1, but that's the only place you see it on the chart. There's one other exception in here, but for the most part, that is what you see. That's because that's what our system incentivizes right now. It incentivizes a focus on those bubble kids right at the pass. I mean, our model right now is dominated by the pass-fail rate. And so that's where the attention has gone. The hope, I think by everybody, was, as you've heard a little bit over the last few minutes, is to put some emphasis on growth for all students so that you don't see this pattern of just everyone staying in the same place, and you don't see only changing occurring at that bubble point. So if you change, my point being, if you change the model, you change the incentives, and I think you'll change the outcome.
So, I sense.
I just wanted to say just a couple
okay,
quick
Shane?
things that caveat off of your original question. I'm a school superintendent. I don't expect that this model is going to improve the status of my district, and I'm not sharing that with my teachers. What we want is
We can.
You just did.
well, I got discussions today anyway. So.
We'll just cut that out of the tape.
But my point, all joking aside, is this. We want to make sure that we have a system that is fair to all students, period.
Right.
And you can't discount the fact that at the local level, that is what we should be holding our teachers accountable for. And I agree with Derek in the fact that we have had a model, and I've been guilty of it as a principal and as a superintendent, where we have focused on bubble kids to get ourselves up to that next level and improve as a district, where I think that once we start focusing on growth for all students across the board, then we're doing a service and not a disservice to our communities. And much to your point, that's what we need to be doing so that we are growing efficient, effective, constructive kids that are going to more than likely stay a lot of times in some of our rural districts. And so I do like some of the work we've done, but you know, back to Jim's point and what I've shared with my teachers, we've got a new test coming, we have a new model coming, we have new standards that we're trying to implement. We can't give them the answers. And so as long as there is a provision in the rulemaking process that allows us to go back and re-look at whatever it is we decide so that we can perfect it and not wait until everything crashes, then I think we're making good progress and we're a growing entity that's just trying to improve education in Indiana.
Michelle?
I think we've talked about this a little bit earlier, but looking at the categorical growth, one of the reasons why we moved away from that was because we weren't seeing the kind of movement that we thought we should be, which is what led us to D. And I think the thing I like about D is that it actually looks at live data for all students, and that informs reasonable targets so that they are reachable and that they're in the increments that they should be.
Claire?
I just want to also mention, and I'm going to defer to a little bit to Dr. Walker on this too, but Damien did address that issue that Derek just brought up around where you see this clustering in the middle, but that's not necessarily because of incentives in the current system of accountability. It's because that's the science behind developing assessments. So
Right.
maybe you could elaborate on that. I think
Assessments
that's
were built to start with.
Go ahead, Michelle. Did you want to elaborate?
Just that I think that's the way, in general, how our assessments were built is trying to discriminate around those cuts. And I think the beauty of the systems we've been discussing as a panel are that we actually want to see growth across the entire spectrum and looking at that as we set new cut scores moving forward.
the other thing I just wanted to mention, so I've had disagreements with some of my panel members, including Derek and Jim, around their objections to certain growth percentiles. And just remind this board that we did have a conversation with Damien Vedder-Benner and Dr. Briggs a number of months ago. And then Damien has come and presented this panel. And one of the things he reminded us of is that we started developing our growth model in Indiana based off of guidance from the U.S. Department of Education that states could allow under AYP to start to include growth in 2005. And we developed that and rolled it out in 2008. And then only after that had been provided to schools, did Indiana start to look at incorporating that in an accountability system, which went into effect for the 11-12 school year. So he reminded us of this long evolution and where that came from, which was a desire to better reflect performance, especially for those schools that have a high percentage of students that have very low proficiency scores, that you wanted to reflect and reward those schools and those educators in those schools for making growth, even if their students were not all at 100% proficiency. The other thing that Damon pointed out to us was how far-reaching the data from the growth model is in our accountability system overall. So we've got growth ratings for educator effectiveness ratings, which is a slightly different way of taking information from the growth model. We also have the 75 charter schools we have in the state have 5 or 7 year contracts, and the largest 3 authorizers all use median SGPs, which is different than the 1 year targets. And then we've got our A through F school accountability system and then our school improvement plan. So all of these things are interrelated, and I think that was part of, in addition to the correlation analyses that Damien did, that showed that a purely categorical or just trajectory model had an unacceptably high, what he called model bias, that actually ended up hurting schools that had a high percentage of low-performing kids and rewarding schools that had a high percentage of high-performing students on the state assessment. That it also was going to call for a complete break in our accountability system and have a disrupting effect. And as we went through our waiver renewal process, that became pretty clear to us that, first of all, that was not consistent with our waiver, which required the ability to calculate growth. So I think that's also been in the back of our minds, is not only did we want to develop a system that could withstand all the changes that we're going through, that would be statistically valid and reliable, that people could rely upon that information, that it was valid information, but also reflected the values that we talked about. So I want to make sure that the board just put all those pieces together, because I know it's been over many, many conversations over many months. I also wanted to explain my no vote, because it is for different reasons than the others who voted no. That, you know, we've worked alongside with Debbie, starting with Molly when she was with us on all of this data analysis, and certainly Damien and Derek have come in and provided expert assessments, and they are really the 2 top experts in the country in this work. What my concerns are about option D is that we're just still not there yet. And I would not be comfortable saying, yes, we've done our work, we've thought through all of these issues, we've thought about, is this the right distribution of A, B, C, D's, F's? More importantly, the baseline growth, both Damien has said to us that it will take 4 years to get valid and reliable data for use in an accountability system. Now, he's provided us with some options for how we can manage through a transition, but I'm not sure we've had that conversation about, are these the right transition steps to take, and what are the implications in terms of confidence in that accountability system. So I don't feel like we have finished that work yet. We've also asked Dr. Derek Briggs to do his own independent assessment of option D, as well as of Damien's assessment of option D, and I think that will be important information for the board to consider. So it's not the individual who developed SGPs, it's somebody outside of that. And Derek will have that ready by our October 15th board meeting. So those were the primary reasons that I voted no, not because I don't think that we've moved in a direction based off of the information that we've received and the values of this panel. It's more that I don't think we're there yet, and we haven't thought through what's going to happen for those 4 years. Are we going to stick with our current system? Are we going to have some in-between system? What exactly are we going to do? And I think those are really important conversations to have.
So Claire, the panel made a lot of growth progress, but we may not be at the performance level.
Trying to end the meeting.
That was succinct.
That was. Thank you.
Based on that, I wonder if this meeting's kind of coming to, for me, it's coming to a close. Now, I like to keep moving, but the point, matter of fact, we have been given, you've done terrific work. Claire, I appreciate your points you just made, because those have been swirling around. They're very much connected with our strategic plan for the whole K-12 in the state. We have a good work product from which to refine. We have to get some more information. We have to make sure the tangents and dots are connected, and we'll have a package. Yeah. And so for me, I'm wanting to learn more about this option D related to Claire's, as usual, succinct and highly professional, intelligent summary. and then we refine it and move down the road. I appreciate all the variables, but we have great educators. Yes, we have higher standards, exactly what we should do. And yes, we're always going to be in continuous improvement mode. And we're going to get better together. That's what, of course, a lot of you are strong leaders. You work every day. Dr. Robbins, you might want to get your resume ready. We go back and visit your teacher today. The point would be, I think we're at a place we can take this work product and refine it with these outstanding questions and move on, and together meet the challenges, not shy away from them, not excuse out of them, but meet the challenge, because it's 10 years from now, that's what we'll be proud of, and that's what our young people need in the state. So for this board member, I think I know the situation, and I really appreciate the work, and I look forward to fine tuning it and get out to the educators and say, let's go to town on this. We can do this together. That's my point.
Is that the consensus of the rest of the panel members? I know Steve had a comment, no?
No, yeah, I'll wait.
I mean, is that the consensus of the board? That you think you've
Yes.
had enough information here today? When you are on your own, and I know that you are very good at reviewing things, but take a look at the decision history that are in the PowerPoint piece, because it does talk to you about changes that we made along the way and where things stand right now. And I urge you to take a look at the resolutions that we will get to you in their current form. And, oh, you have them ready? Okay. So take a look at those at your leisure, because as Claire said, you know, we're all cognizant that we're going to have a little transition here on how this actually happens. So, you know, that goes forward. But it will give you a sense of where the panel is currently on the various components.
The only other thing I wanted to make sure the board was aware of, and maybe this is a question for the co-chairs of the panel and the panel members, is that we are under the gun in terms of our timeline under HCA 1427. And so I hear follow-up steps, but not how that's going to happen. And so I guess the question to the panel members and the co-chairs is the panel going to continue to convene? Does the board want to just take this up and make sure we carve out sufficient time at board
I think
meetings?
it's in our lap. I think they did their work. I think they did it well. I think it's in our lap.
Consensus with that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Claire, I know that we had, I didn't see it, and you may have received it, the recommended kind of timeline going forth. We'll talk about that at the October 15th meeting?
Yep.
Okay. All right. So with that, I suppose we can, I need a motion to adjourn. Do I have a second?
Second.
So adjourned. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed?
We early?
We are early, 35 minutes, and we started 45 late.